It's starting to feel like summertime to me, and for me, summertime is reading season. That's the time when I have more time to curl up with a book. My family is going to be traveling to Florida at the end of this week, and my daughters and I are going to need to coordinate our reading material so that we can rotate those books around so that we all have something to read while the guys are off fishing. Esther has already loaned me a book that I'm planning to take along. If the rest of you have great reads that you want to recommend, I'd be happy to know about those. I don't even have to have the copy of the book because I have a Kindle, which I can download those on at any time, which can be a very hazardous thing, especially if the Kindle gets a hold of my church credit card number. I have kind of a bad reading habit. It's especially bad because I like to read mysteries. I'm particularly partial to British mysteries. The habit is, after I have read for a while in the book and the plot starts to get tangled and I can't figure out how it's going to be resolved, I skip to the end of the book and read the last couple pages just to be sure if it comes out okay. What I have found after reading thousands of books is that once you know the beginning of the story, the next most important part of the book is how the story ends. That's why I've chosen what might seem like an unlikely pair of scriptural texts for us today. It's not only what each of them says, which is important, but it's their placement in the story. They both come from the good book, the best book, a book which I'll also be reading this summer, although I might not take it out on the beach with me. As you know, Genesis is the first book of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Genesis is not only at the beginning of the Bible. The name Genesis means beginning. It's the story of how things started. The story of time before time. What was before was. The opening chapters of Genesis are the story of God's words creating something out of nothing. God creating the first human by breathing life into dust. Whether or not this actually happened as an empirical, scientific way is not the point of the story. The story is about where we come from. We were created by God and given life by God. And where does God put this new creature? Does he send them right out into the school of hard knocks? God puts this creature in a garden, the most beautiful place that the biblical writers could imagine. A garden which is fertile and fruitful, a garden which is watered continuously from underground so that it never needs to rain, a garden whose very name, Eden, means pleasure or delight. God puts this creature in a place which is literally delightful, symbolized by trees heavy with fruit, ripe for the taking. And in the center of this garden is the tree of life, with fruit so powerful that the knowledge of it could kill you. That's where our story begins. Now, a lot happens in the next 65 books of the story. I'm not going to go through that whole story for you. If you want to hear that whole story, come for about the next year or so and you'll get a lot of it. Some of it's history, some of it's songs and poetry, and there are letters and prophecy. There are stories within this story and parables within those stories. But for now, I want to skip to the end. This is the part of the story which has not happened yet. It's a vision. It's a revelation of how the story is going to end. It's a great ending, I just have to tell you. The creation which began in the Garden of Eden ends in the city of God. It's a new creation, but some of the same symbolism is there. There's flowing water and a tree of life, but instead of fruit, which is the knowledge of good and evil and the possibility of death, this tree has leaves which promote only life and healing. Nothing in the city of God will kill you, for the presence of God is there, symbolized by the Lamb, the embodiment of the crucified and resurrected Christ who has defeated evil and death forever. I am indebted to Rebecca Parker and Rita Nakashima Brock, the authors of a book called Saving Paradise, for opening up this vision of Christianity for me. Their book is a research and theological book. It's also a book about Christian art. They decided to go look in Christian art and see when the first images of Jesus on the cross as an image of Christianity show up in Christian history. Do you know when it is? It's about 900 A.D. The church went for almost 1,000 years before they created that image as the central image of Christianity. Now, of course, it's a story that's at the heart of the story, but the authors of Saving Paradise asked themselves, if it was 900 years until we got Jesus on the cross as the image, what was the image before then for the first 900 years? There are many images, of course, but one of them that occurs over and over again is a garden. And like any image that gets used over and over again, it became stylized, had its own kind of symbolism. Often there were 3 rivers for the Trinity, 12 sheep representing the 12 apostles. I don't pretend to understand all of the significance, but I would like to take you on a little garden tour to see how Christians have represented the tree of life in the last 700 years or so of our history. Some of these images are specifically taken from these stories in the Bible. Some of them are more general images of trees and water. You don't need mosquito repellent or sunscreen. You can just stay where you are. The gardens will come to you. There's going to be some music that's played during that too. It is by Brethren composer Sean Kirshner. Sean wrote this song, Zion. He is the lead vocalist for the song, and he's joined by his bandmates from the group Kindling. So enjoy the garden tour. It lasts about 2 minutes. The middle of the story is important. It's where the plot and the characters develop, where tensions arise, and where we begin to long for resolution. Jesus Christ is at the center of the Christian story. Jesus' ministry, witness, death, and resurrection are how we understand who we are and how we are shaped as Christians. But like any story, the beginning of the story is really important. It's what sets the scenes and the context for everything else that follows. If you don't understand what happens at the beginning of the story, you're going to spend the rest of the book trying to make sense of what happens next. Our story, the story of creation and of God's creative power, begins with us being brought to life by the breath of God, set down in a place of beauty and care and being pronounced good. These are vital things to remember because they tell us about who we are and about who God is. Even though things go wrong in a hurry, And humanity gets things into such a tangle that the incarnation of God has to come down to sort things out. God's work is still not finished. It's easy to look around and come to the conclusion, pardon the expression, that humanity is a damned mess. But friends, we know the end of the story. There is a symmetry in that biblical account that is not coincidence. Maybe trees and water are symbols which run deep in the human psyche. A well-watered garden is bound to grab the imagination of people who lived in the desert. But even for those of us who live in Midwestern America, where we can turn on a spigot and water our lawns, there is something enchanting about these images. They speak of God's care in creating a place for us, a place for humanity before we even came into existence, and God continuing to care for us throughout eternity. These biblical bookends of the tree of life affirm that the gift of life, the very breath of God, is God's desire for everyone. Many of you know that my husband, Tim, is a psychiatrist. He doesn't talk to me about his patients very much, but he mentioned one this past week. This was a young man whom he'd seen in his office several times over a period of months who was suffering from depression. This young man would come in with a hoodie over his head, sit with his face down, could barely answer questions. He wasn't able to work. He was trying to figure out how he could survive on disability. He came into Tim's office last week. His hoodie was off of his head. He could look Tim in the eye and speak in full sentences. He had started taking the medication that Tim had been trying to work with him to take for months. And Tim said, "What changed? What made you to decide to start taking your medicine?" And he said, "I had to work. I didn't want to die. I need to live." And that is the transformation that we are called to as Christians, to make the statement that we do not want to die, we want to live. And we not only want to live for ourselves, we want to live in such a way so that others can experience the abundance and goodness of God's life as well. Sometimes it's hard work. Life is a gift that we have all been given, but nobody promised us that life was going to be easy. We are called to live in this world which cultivates the gift of life, not only for us, but for all people. I hope that you can see the tree of life around you, not just on the chancel table or on the quilt behind me or on our entryway in our church, but in one another too, in the ministries that we do in this church, in our community and our world, ministries of prayer and outreach and support. We embody the tree of life in our worship and our singing, in our praying, in our outreach, and in our fellowship. We are all a part of the tree of life, called to share God's love for the healing of the nations and for one another. Thank God for the gift of life and hope in Jesus Christ. May goodness and mercy follow you all the days of your life, from the beginning until the very end. Amen.